Well, thanks so much for making time in busy schedules for those of you who are online and also in the classroom. It's a real pleasure to be here with you. It's kind of scary. I did realize it was 2014. It feels like a very, very long time ago. Then I was in a classroom much like the one you're in right now. So really pleased to be able to join you here from, I'm actually in Melbourne at the moment, hence the sort of fancy background. It's not where I live, it's a hotel room, in case any of you was wondering. So really excited to join you and chat to you a little bit about what we've been doing at Applied over the last couple of years, trying to apply behavioural science to improve hiring decisions and ultimately to make sure that we can build diverse, inclusive and equitable organisations. So I'm going to start sharing my screen and I'll just ask for someone to confirm for me that you can see my screen here.
It's perfect. Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, wonderful. So I'm super excited to share with you a little bit about why we built Applied. For many of you, you'll be either directly familiar with or already the choir around why we would want to create an organization looking at debiasing hiring decisions. But I'll take you through a little bit about the history of why we created Applied, and then I really wanted to share a few of the experiments that we ran in the early days of Applied and why it is that we built some of the features of Applied the way that we did. I'll then share with you a little bit of some statistics that we've been pulling together and data we've seen about how debiasing hiring decisions using technology can make a marked difference to organizations. And then I'm really, really excited to chat to those of you in the classroom and online about undoubtedly many questions that you will have about why we do what we do and the implications for different organizations. So without further ado, I thought I'd start with a little bit of an experiment, and I'm hoping many of you haven't had seen this one before, but I thought it'd be useful just to sort of get the brain cells firing, maybe as much for my benefit at 5:30 in the morning as for yours. So what I'd love you to do is pull out a pen and paper or the proverbial phone. I'll let you do that. And I'd love you to just pause for a second and listen to the words that I'm going to put up on the screen for you here. I don't want you to write anything down at this stage. Okay, so because of the hour it is at my end, I thought I'd choose some set of words that you might start to see a theme on. So the first word is nap. The second word is peace. Then yawn. Hopefully none of you are doing that just yet. Drowsy. Doze. Bed, rest, awake, tired, dream, wake, snooze, blanket, slumber, and snore. Okay, now I would love you to write down the words that you can remember. I know many of you Harvard types love a target, so I'll just remind you I had 15 words. But don't worry, I won't ask you to tell me how many of them you've remembered. Okay, it's usually, I can't see all of you closely enough, but usually at about this point, people start sort of staring at the ceiling, hoping for some kind of divine intervention.
I think that's right, Kate.
So let's test a couple here. And I'm going to call on you here, Eris, to help me with at least a bit of a sense of the numbers in the room. So how many of you remember the word dream?
Okay, I'm going to
put your hands up.
Almost everyone, I would say. Not quite everyone, but I would say 3/4, many.
3/4. Okay, great. What about the word sleep?
That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I would say about a third.
About a third. Okay, great. And dose?
Yep.
Fewer, a quarter.
Okay, great. So about those words, the ones of you who remember the word sleep, I'm now going to show you the list of words here. And you might notice I didn't give you the word sleep.
Oh, no way.
But do not worry. If you remember the word sleep, don't worry, you're in very, very good company. In fact, I would hazard a guess that you are slightly better than the average. So what I shared with you was an example of an experiment that they've been running since about the 1920s on what we now think of as false recall. So essentially what I did is I tricked your mind. I gave you a series of words, 15 words, all of them in this sort of constellation of concepts that surround the word sleep, but I didn't actually give you the word sleep. And your brain did the very natural thing of, once it started writing out words related to sleep, it sort of assumed that sleep must have been one of the words in that list. So they've done these sorts of experiments using all sorts of different concepts where you sort of remove the underlying concept, but maintain the words that sort of sit around it. And the brain is very easily tricked, though it turns out your group is slightly less tricked than the average. And for what it's worth, I fell prey to this the first time somebody put this particular test on me. So you might well be asking, I thought we were here to talk about inclusive organizations. What is this woman doing talking to me about sleep? Well, it's not just because I wanted to sort of put you through your paces at the beginning of a talk, but it's mostly because what we try to do when we think about behavioral science at Applied is we try to make sure that everybody recognizes that we are all prey to a lot of these behavioral biases that we're going to be talking about, and the things that we want to be sort of designing around in technology, because the reality is that the brain is very easily tricked. And this was just one of those sorts of examples. So I thought I'd move away from that particular experiment to one that I know some of you in the classroom are familiar with. But for those of you online, I thought I'd share with you another type of sort of brain experiment here, which is that the kind of way that this particular sort of brain trick was set up is that you might be able to see that there are two tiles, and one tile is labeled A and one is labeled B. And so I'm going to do the thing that I think some of you in the classroom have seen before and ask somebody to tell me which of these tiles, A or B, is darker. Anybody willing to hazard a guess there?
I think the class is going to hesitate, Kate, but I see A as being darker.
Okay,
I've seen this 100 times.
I know. I mean, this is the problem when you run experiments as part of your test, is a part of your presentation is nobody trusts you. So yes, to most eyes, A will look like the darker of the tiles. But what I'm going to do now is remove some of the distractions that are getting in the way of the way that you look at these particular tiles. And if you're like most people, it suddenly becomes revealed, particularly at that last step, that A and B are actually the same shade of grey. I'm going to remove them just quickly for those of you who, again, don't trust me, and return them. So what I'm doing here is yet another one of these sort of brain experiments. But essentially what's happening is that this grey cylinder is casting a shadow over some of these tiles, this checkerboard. And what the brain is doing is it's accounting for that shadow and changing essentially what the brain's seeing in the pixelation of the color underneath tile B, and assuming that therefore tile B must be significantly lighter than tile A. But if you remove those distractions, you start to see that actually at the pixel level, the two tiles are exactly the same. Okay, so we've talked about checkerboards and we've talked about sleep and nothing to do with inclusive organizations. So let's get on to how bias impacts recruitment decisions. What I've shared with you now are just two such ways that sort of psychologists over the years have tried to prove that there is something that happens in the brain in the way that we interpret information, and sometimes that leads us astray. So let's talk about a few examples of how that can be true in recruitment decisions. So many experiments have been run over recent years on how people's chances of getting jobs in the labour market can be affected by the way in which information is presented. So I'm going to share with you one example of such an experiment done in 2016 in Germany, where they took similar candidates. In fact, they took identical candidates by background, so by educational background and work history. And every other part of these candidates was exactly the same, barring the picture on the front of that CV or resume and the name at the top. So the first sort of randomized group of candidates, randomized group of employers received an application from a woman called Sandra Bauer. And this is what Sandra Bauer looked like. So about 19% of the time, Sandra Bauer was lucky enough to get a call back for an interview for this job. Another third of employers randomly selected received an application from this same candidate, exactly the same work history and same education history, only this time her name was Miriam Ozturk. And her rate of callback for interview fell from 19% to 14%. So it's worth just saying here, for those of you who aren't familiar with the German labour market, the reason why there were pictures on the front is that's sort of culturally most common in Germany, to include a picture on the front of your resume. And what the experimenters were doing here was they were moving from what was considered to be a stereotypically German sounding name to a stereotypically Turkish sounding name, which is one of the largest ethnic minority groups in Germany. So you can see that just going from Sandra to Miriam reduced her chances of being called back for interview by 5% points, or almost 25%. The third group of employers randomly selected received an application from the exact same candidate by work history and education history. Her name was Miriam Ozturk, but she was also wearing a headscarf. And you can see her rate of callback for interview dropped quite dramatically. So for many of you, you'll look at this, and perhaps particularly for those of you in this particular classroom, you won't be hugely surprised by what I'm seeing here, but I'm sure many of you can share with me the sort of disappointment in seeing how stark these differences really are. So this was done over about 6,000 employers all over Germany. And what I like about this particular study, despite its depressing results, is that they also tested a lot of other things in addition to just name changes and also signals of the religious background of this particular candidate. They tested things like, did this sort of level of bias change depending on the seniority of the role at hand? And they found in general, yes, the more senior the role became, the more bias we saw against Miriam Ozturk wearing a headscarf. They also tested a few other things, like did this particular level of bias change based on things like whether it was a German-only organization or whether it was connected to a more international workforce. And interestingly, we didn't see a huge difference by level of internationalization of the workforce, even though many of us might have posited that you'd see slightly less bias in more international organizations. So again, this is just one experiment, but it actually represents a type of experiment, what we call sort of correspondence studies, that have been run since the 1970s. And now what I'm sharing with you is how these types of correspondence studies have changed in the UK over that period. And you can see here, just looking at the sort of rate of bias against job applications of candidates who appear to have Pakistani heritage, there's been essentially no trend or reduction in the rate of bias against those candidates over that time. If we were to look at similar kinds of studies done in the United States, you'd see equally no real evidence of any statistical decline in the rate of discrimination against Black candidates in the United States. There is some evidence from this meta-analysis that there may be a reduction for Latinx candidates, but it's not statistically significant. So I've taken a series of very, very depressing studies, though sadly, probably many of you have either experienced versions of this or are quite aware that it's this problem of bias in recruitment decisions. But what some of you might not know is that it's not just recruitment. So I thought I'd share with you an example of another experiment that's been done, including by some of Iris's colleagues at Harvard, looking at investment decisions. So a particular set of researchers were looking at whether or not the way that a particular company is pitched for investment affects its likelihood of being called in for sort of angel investment by a series of investors. So what they did is they took the same pitch deck about a particular business opportunity. And what they did, it was all done online. So potential investors who were real investors could view this particular pitch deck online. And what they did is they experimentally varied two things. One was the voiceover of the pitch deck. And the second thing was the picture of the founder that came at the end of that pitch deck. So what they found is the likelihood, which ranged, so they asked at the end, would you be likely to invest in this particular business? And they gave a scale of sort of 0 to 7. And they found for a male voice with a quote unquote low attractive founder at the end, the likelihood of getting investment was sort of hovered around 4.6. But when they changed that picture at the end, kept the same voice and same pitch deck, and added a sort of what might be considered an attractive male, that went from 4.6 to 5.2. But let's compare that to if it was a female founder of really any level of attractiveness, and you can see that there was a significant reduction, regardless of attractiveness level. So for women, it doesn't matter whether you're attractive or not, it just matters that you're a woman. But for men, if you can be an attractive man, that can really set you in good stead if you're looking for investment decisions. What they later did is they also asked what might be behind some of these decisions. So sort of trying to unearth from investors why it is that they were sort of more likely to invest in these pitches. And they found that the investors that viewed the exact same pitch deck presented by men is they were more likely to rate those pitches as being more persuasive, more logical, and more fact-based. So for some reason, what we were seeing is that the brain does some post hoc rationalization and seems to associate the presentation of a particular pitch by men as being more likely to be characterized by these types of traits. So now what I'm going to share with you is two potential candidates. And let's imagine I'm sort of describing them for you. Let's say I know them and I say, oh, Sarah, she's super intelligent, she's industrious, she's impulsive though, and a bit stubborn and a bit envious. And let's imagine I present Isabel and I say, she's a bit envious, she's stubborn and impulsive, but she's industrious and intelligent. And I'd like you to tell me which of these two candidates you'd be more likely to hire on the basis of just the 5 descriptive words that I've used here. Anyone? Yeah, right? Like, even though I've read this and written this, I still feel a little bit more inclined towards Sarah than I do to Isabel. But I'm sure many of you are now staring at it pretty intensely, and you can see that the 5 words I've used to describe them are precisely the same. All I've done is change the order in which I show you these particular character traits of these two imaginary candidates. So let's put all of these types of studies together, and I know there are many, many others, and we know, therefore, that there are a series of things that can affect our decision-making. So what I've shared with you in this past one is something to do with the order in which information is presented to you. So what I thought I'd share with you now is how we thought about doing this at Applied. So let's go back to about the end of 2014 and early 2015, which incidentally was the sort of time when I first tentatively gave Iris an email and said, hey, we're thinking about trying to do some experiments to remove bias in hiring decisions. Can I chat to you? And very, very fortunately for me, she wasn't quite as overstacked as she is right now. And she accepted that random email from me and we had a phone call. And that started what has been many years of collaboration with her and others to try to build out a technology platform that will try and account for these biases. And so early days, one of the things that Iris was as passionate as we were about was actually running experiments ourselves. We knew that there had been decades of fantastic studies by researchers all over the world proving that there were all of these different ways in which bias affects hiring decisions and affects the way that we interpret others and their skill levels. But what we wanted to do is start to test out what are some of the things that we can see in very, very specific hiring settings, and use that insight to help us design out that bias from the get-go. So what I'm going to share with you now is an example of what we studied around ordering effects. So we did an online experiment back in 2015, looking at how information is presented to reviewers about candidates and how that affects the decisions that they make about candidate skill. So we ran a huge experiment where we changed up the order in which candidates were presented to potential reviewers. And we used that to then test out these sorts of differences. And the first difference that we found was that the order in which candidates appear can have a significant impact on the scores that they're given by reviewers. So the first finding that we had was that if you were an average candidate, you tended to receive an average score of about 3.35. Now, we'd constructed these candidates with an average sort of set of skills. So the average score of candidates was about 3.35 out of 5. But if you were the candidate that was first, on average, you got a bump up to 3.52. So we saw at the beginning that there was this sort of early bird effect, that what we saw in our data was that scores in general started off more highly for candidates and sort of dwindled over time as people became sort of more tired when they were reviewing candidates, potentially more bored, potentially hungrier. So the second finding that we then had was looking at how candidate scoring was affected by the candidate that came immediately before. So many of you who've read a lot of Iris's work and others' work will know that there's these concepts of sort of framing effects and sort of reference effects, or even anchoring. So what we found was what we've later referred to as the sort of Nobel Prize winner effect. And we found that candidates who were reviewed after a great candidate, so let's say a candidate that was really very impressive, those next candidates got marked down by about 4%. The candidates that came after a poorer candidate got marked up by about 2%. So what are we sort of seeing here? What we saw was that the brain changes its reference effect. So once it sees a really fantastic candidate, it's got a new higher sort of reference mark in its mind about what good looks like from a candidate. And if you're the candidate that comes immediately after that fantastic candidate, you're somewhat unlucky because by contrast, your application doesn't shine. And it turns out that reviewers sort of mark you down as a result. If, however, you come after a poorer candidate, you're more likely to get bumped up. And we found that these effects were quite persistent and quite strong in the statistical significance concept. Now, these sorts of effects, though, however, to many of you might think, well, they don't look huge. But if we start to put together these effects over the course of an application, we found that they could be quite sizable. So what we found was that they could be the difference between being ranked the best candidate in the field and the 12th candidate in the field of about 75 candidates, or the sort of 12th to the 29th. So what they can make the difference of is whether or not you sort of shine quite significantly within a hiring process, or you're right on the border of whether you'd likely be brought through to an interview, or whether you're just lucky enough to get an interview or significantly outside of the running for that. So we found that these seemingly small effects can compound over time over the course of a large application and can end up being quite sizable in terms of your chances of getting that next job. So this was the first set of experiments that we ran in Applied, looking at different types of ordering effects and the ways that that might affect the scores that you get as a candidate. And it led us to doing a thing which we'll later talk about around randomization. But I thought I'd sort of then come back up to say, this was just one set of biases that we could identify when we were pulling together Applied. And now there are circa 180 biases that different researchers have identified. And of course, there was no way for us to sort of account for all of them, but we decided we needed to have some interesting design tricks that we thought would account for the vast majority of the ways in which the brain can sometimes get tricked in hiring decisions. And we came up with a process that was aiming to do exactly this. So I know some of you in the classroom, I sort of chatted to you about this earlier, about the A and B tiles. And I'd like you to just think about whether the knowledge that I gave you at the beginning of this particular class, which is that A is not in fact darker than B if you remove all of the distractions, and ask you to try to unsee the reality that B looks lighter than A. Unless you're extraordinary, and I know many of you are, so maybe this can work for you, but unless you're extraordinary, it's very, very hard to unsee that B looks lighter than A, even when you have that knowledge. And for many of us in organizations, we use things like diversity training and unconscious bias training to sort of unsee the bias that we know exists in the world. But unfortunately, as I'm sure many of you have kind of come across, sadly, the research around unconscious bias training and diversity training suggests that it doesn't have lasting effects on our brains. And what we really need to be starting to do is designing the worlds around us to try and account for what we know to affect our decisions, rather than hoping that every day we wake up being the most extraordinary version of ourselves. So that's sort of what motivated us at Applied and helped us to think about what would technology be able to do to help us unsee these exact biases. So how do we work with the brain and not against it? At Applied, some of the things that we aim to do is we aim to test skills directly wherever possible and rely less on the proxies and make fewer assumptions about candidates. We aim to remove the opportunities for bias to intrude upon the way that we make decisions at any point in the hiring decision. And then we try to optimize the way we look at information and make those decisions to make sure that they're as empirical as and ethical as possible. So let's talk about removing some of these opportunities for bias. Let's just think about affinity bias here. Let's imagine this is a typical CV or a resume of a candidate called Robert. What might be happening for the average reviewer of this candidate is they sort of pick up unconsciously things like maybe they're the same race, ethnicity, or nationality, or even gender that they are. Unconsciously or even consciously, they might be like, oh, Google's an American company in the Bay Area, just like us. Or that job title is just like the one that I used to have. Or I had a friend who worked in that organization and they were really great. Or maybe even these were the sorts of things that I did in my educational background. Or even someone I used to know went to that university. So these are all of the sort of subtle cues that exist in somebody's CV or resume or on their LinkedIn profile that elicit parts of the brain that might draw affinity toward that particular candidate. But what about if we had a look at some of the things that might also be happening here? So one of the things could be happening is that there may be some kind of halo effect, which is to say, you know, we pull out one piece of information about a candidate that we think is particularly positive, and that sort of casts this positive halo over information that we see elsewhere in their application. There may be some form of confirmation bias. So let's say we think working at Google is a really strong positive signal about a candidate's quality. And even though this person might only have worked there for 3 months or even 3 years, we think, well, there's probably a good reason for that because, you know, you don't get hired at Google unless you're really impressive. Or maybe there's something we think that comes into play here around groupthink. So maybe a candidate is particularly strong in your mind because your manager has said that they really like candidates that come from that particular organization, and you trust your manager's judgment. So even though you might have a different opinion, you don't feel, you know, open to being able to speak out against your manager. Or indeed, maybe just because you trust your manager, you're more likely to think more positively about a particular candidate. And then finally, there may be some stereotype biases here. So maybe this candidate studied at Cambridge in the UK, and you assume, therefore, that they must be pretty smart and good for the role. But you might be thinking, gosh, that was a while ago. Maybe this candidate might be a little old for this particular role, particularly if we're hiring into a technology role where we typically have a lower average age of the kind of candidate profile. So all of these types of biases might be intruding. Some of them may be positive, some of them may be negative. But either way, these are the sorts of things that might be going on in the brain and influencing the way that you interpret particular information about that candidate. Either way, what we're not looking at here is this candidate really skilled to do the job at hand? So what if we were to start to remove some of this information and instead start to focus on the things that we think are better predictors of performance? So let's have a little bit of a think specifically about what these skills are that we might be able to elicit that allows us to test what candidates are really capable of and make fewer assumptions about them based purely on the sort of bolded items in their CV or their resume. What I'm sharing with you now is some meta-analyses about the types of things that candidates tend to get tested on in hiring processes. And you'll see there that we've got things like years of education, years of experience, and even reference checks actually show up as being less predictive of job performance. That is, they describe less of the variation in candidates' performance when they're actually in the role than things that sit at the top of this list, which include things like work sample tests, structured interviews, and general cognitive ability tests. What we see in general is that the closer that you get to testing candidates on the real things that they're going to do in the job, the more likely it is that you will be able to select a candidate that's going to shine in that particular role. And interestingly, the things that sit at the bottom of this list tend to be the things that are most prevalent in CVs and resumes, and also most salient in the information that we see on CVs and resumes. So at Applied, we were really interested not only in removing the bias from hiring decisions, but also helping organizations select candidates in ways that's more likely to be predictive of finding people who will stay and thrive in those roles. So at the same time as we were looking at design tricks to remove bias, we were also looking at ways of sort of foregrounding the information we thought was most likely to be most useful when making those decisions. So let's talk a little bit about how we thought about doing that at Applied. And bear with me, my screen seems to be freezing a little bit here. Yes. So one of the things that we were looking to do was help candidates to show, not tell, the skills that they were looking to show in hiring process. So essentially what we thought about doing was removing the kind of competency-based assessments that organizations use to being more work-based. So instead of asking candidates to tell me about a time when you sold a particular software product, if you were looking for a particular candidate, we'd say, come in with a 10-minute pitch about how you would sell this particular software product. Or instead of asking candidates to tell us about a time when they coded using C++, we'd instead ask them to do a coding task together with somebody else in the team that would allow them to show their particular skills in C++. Likewise, imagine that you were trying to hire a candidate who was analyzing data, for example. Instead of tell me about a time when you analyze data for commercial purposes, instead take half an hour to analyze an existing data set and tell us what you found and talk us through your findings. Or finally, let's imagine that you were hiring a candidate that was teaching kids. So instead of asking them to ask us about how they did that, instead come in and teach a particular class. And incidentally, I understand that's still how a lot of Iris's colleagues get hired into Harvard, is actually teaching classes, mock classes. So this is just an example of not only moving away from CVs and resumes, but actually getting one up on what is also the most likely next thing that we do, which is asking candidates to tell us about a time, and instead getting them to show us the skills that they might have. The reason why we thought getting beyond competency-based questions was important is typically these sort of tell us about a time when competency-based questions tend to benefit the kinds of people who've been taught how to answer them really, really well. So many of us have been taught this star-based response, tell me about the situation, the task, the action, and your reaction. And a lot of the types of candidates who are really strong at that have had coaching in how to do that. Whereas when you actually ask candidates to show their skills, you find there are a lot of people who might not be as sort of willing to sort of present themselves super confidently, but nevertheless have the skills that you're looking for. So let's pull some of this together into an actual example. I'm sharing with you a couple of examples of the types of tasks that candidates at Applied do. So if you were hiring a communications director, for example, the example question that you might be getting if you were being hired through Applied is, you're pitching a particular press release about a new product that an organization's launched. The journalists you reached at major newspapers tell you that they don't have space for such topics during COVID-19. Write an email responding to why they should publish this particular new launch of this particular product. So here what we're looking for are things like persuasiveness and the writing skills that a candidate has, which at the end of the day are the sorts of things that matter most for a communications director. Or let's imagine that you're hiring an engineer. Again, you might present them with a particular work sample question that says, users have complained about slow load times on the app. These pages are built using a server rendered in JS and jQuery. What extra information would you look for, and how would you think about improving load times on the website? So a really practical example of the sort of thing that we'd be expecting these candidates to help us with if they were joining the team. What we're looking for are things like attention to detail and the problem solving that this particular candidate might be bringing to the role. So let's pull some of these things together, and I'll share with you some of the ways in which we've tried to account for these biases at Applied. So an ideal screening process at Applied looks a bit like this. Your typical hiring process would have you have, let's say, these three candidates, Mrs. Blue, Mr. Gold, and Ms. Aqua. And of course, you might have picked up by this point that we're not as interested in having CVs. In fact, we're going to remove them entirely from the screening process and instead have those candidates answer these work sample based assessments. So answer usually 3 to 5 questions over 250 words in response each about real world challenges that they might face in the role that they're looking to be hired to. So they answer these work sample based assessments and then they come into the team to be screened. But before screening them, we're going to do 4 different things to change the information for those reviewers so that they don't fall prey to the kinds of biases that we talked about at the early part of this. First of all, you might have picked up, we're going to anonymize all of those candidate applications and just have the answers to these questions. So all we're looking for is the skills that these candidates have and none of their background information. So anonymization is the first thing that we do. But to account for some of the behavioral biases that we talked about earlier, we're also going to chunk up this information by question rather than by candidate. So think about that almost like horizontal chunking up of information rather than vertical. So instead of reading Laura's application top to bottom and then Iris's top to bottom and then Siri's top to bottom, we're going to read each of their answers to question 1 first, and then their answers to question 2 and then 3. And the reason why we do this is it's cognitively less taxing on the brain to stay on one task at one time. And it also helps us to account for some of these ordering effects. What it also allows us to do is in an anonymized context, I'm not able to connect that it's Iris's application the whole way through. So I'm reviewing her answers to each individual skill area without the risk of these halo effects or these spillover effects over different areas. She may be really strong in one area, but I'm not going to let that affect my evaluation of her in another. So we first anonymize, then we chunk. And then what we do is we randomize the order that each of these candidates come through for review by different reviewers. And the reason we do that is, as I talked about earlier in the call, we identified that early candidates tend to be scored a bit more highly, and candidates that come after really phenomenal candidates tend to be disproportionately scored down. And we didn't want that to disproportionately affect any one candidate over another. So we randomize each of these candidates so everyone gets a fair shot throughout different aspects of their application. And then we allow different reviewers to review them in different orders. And they don't see each other's scores. So there's no risk of groupthink happening here. There's no risk that my evaluation of a candidate will affect my colleague's evaluation. And so we pull together all of these different scores that different reviewers give for different candidate parts of candidate applications. And then we pull all of those together to identify which candidate at the end of the day seems to have the types of skill levels that we're looking for at Applied. So all of this may sound like a lot of work, but actually the vast majority of this is all happening in the background in the kind of design of the technology. As a reviewer, all you're doing is looking at candidate applications as you ordinarily would, and we're taking the responsibility as the technology platform for removing all of the ways in which those decisions may be affected by context, not by the quality of the candidate that they're seeing. So this is a room full of people who are trained to be skeptical of the information that they have in front of them. And many of you may be thinking, well, that's all good and well, but does it actually work? Which is to say that you might trust that the many experiments that we use to pull these sorts of features of our platform together all sound like they may have an impact on hiring decisions, but what does it look like in the real world? So what I thought I'd share with you is early on, we had exactly that same fear. We had that same worry that, you can take findings from lab studies, you can take them from even the best field experiments, even from our own experiments, but you put them in the real world with real hiring decisions and they may not hold out. So we ran what was sort of our best attempt at a full randomized control trial early on in Applied's history to sort of bear that out using real candidates to a real job. So the setup of the experiment is we had about 700 candidates applying to be sort of associates within the behavioral insights team. So these were sort of graduate level jobs at the behavioral insights team. So it was a real job and real candidates. We had them do a multiple choice test, which you might remember is one of the most predictive ways that we can test candidates at scale. That tested their ability on statistics and behavioral science. So we were looking specifically at their capacity to do some of the things they were expected to do in the role. We also had them supply us with their CV and also answer 5 work-related questions that would get at the very skills that we were looking for. So after the multiple choice test, we had 160 candidates that did well enough on that test, and their CV and their applied questions were then sent to 2 sets of reviewers independently and reviewed by different people in each of those particular areas. So we had 2 people reviewing all of their CVs, and we had 3 people independently reviewing all of their answers to these work sample-based questions. They were sort of help us to pitch a particular piece of work to a potential client, what might have been one of them. We also had them, talk about how they would research, writing a sort of particular research analysis that we might be doing for another set of clients. They were very work-related. So what we had, therefore, is for these 160 candidates, we had essentially 5 different evaluations of them, 2 reviews of their CVs and 5 reviews of all of their answers to applied. And each of these was independent of one another. And we allowed the best performing candidates from each of these 2 processes to come through to an assessment centre. So you could get through to that assessment centre because we loved what we saw in your CV or your resume, or because we loved what we saw in your answers to these questions, or because you performed really well on both of them. So those candidates then went through to a very rigorous assessment centre that tested them for about 3 or 4 hours, on work samples with 5 different reviewers. The best performers of those went through to final interviews. And then finally, we made job offers to about 11 candidates out of that process. So you might see here that what we were trying to do essentially was have a treatment and a control. We had the treatment, which was the CV and resume. The control, which was the CV and resume, and the treatment was their applied. And we were comparing whether or not these types of scores bore out later on in terms of the people that we were ultimately offering jobs to. So what we found when we had a bit of a look at the results of this is we tried to correlate what scores we saw in these screening processes with how these candidates performed in the assessment centre, which we saw as being a pretty good depiction of their actual real world on the job performance. Now, bear in mind, we were trying to test this before that actually started. So we were trying to get as close as we could to what it looked like when you're actually in the job, interacting with other candidates on collaborative tasks and with people in the team on particular tests. So what we saw was there was a very strong positive correlation, which was statistically significant, between the score that we'd given them on their applied answers and how they performed in the assessment centre, which is to say candidates that did really well in these 5 work sample-based questions tended to do better in the assessment centre than those who performed less well. Now, to some extent, that was great, and it was validation that we were testing similar kinds of skill areas. But it also was sort of what we might have expected, which is to say both sets of those assessments were work sample related. So we would expect them to be positively correlated. But what we found, which was quite interesting, was that the CV score that these candidates had been given bore no real relationship to how well they performed in these sort of real world settings in the assessment centre. So while it looks, negatively correlated here, note that it isn't statistically significant, but directionally it looked like actually the candidates that we'd scored more highly on their CVs tended to perform less well in the assessment centre. But we can't say that with statistical significance. Either way, we found that the applied scores were much better predictors of how these candidates were going to do in later rounds of recruitment. And the CVs actually weren't that helpful in identifying the best performing candidates. When we then carried that through the final interviews and all the way through to offer, we found final interviews showed exactly the same result that we see here, but the statistical significance dropped off just because of the sample sizes. But what we found when we looked at the final candidates that got hired, it turned out that actually 60% of the candidates we ultimately hired through that process would not have been hired if we'd just been looking at their CVs. And in fact, they only got through because their work sample questions on applied were rated highly, and they were sort of found by that process, but would otherwise have been discarded on the basis of their CV. What we later discovered, therefore, was about 3 times as many CVs would have needed to be reviewed to get the same number of top candidates through applied. So we found that this was not only likely to unearth candidates we otherwise wouldn't have selected, but it was also more efficient at identifying the candidates that we ultimately thought were great hires for the team. Now, for those of you who are interested in diversity, you'll be interested to know that actually we found quite sizable uplifts on diversity. We found directional evidence that we were more likely to select candidates from more diverse ethnic minority backgrounds, quite substantial evidence that we found more candidates who are more diverse on their educational background, and to some extent also on their work history. The applied team, the behavioural insights team at the time was fairly gender balanced, and we didn't see any real effects on gender in this particular experiment. But as I'll show you shortly, that isn't true for other organisations. So let's have a bit of a look at some of the data. We've now had close to 500,000 candidates come through applied using exactly this method. And so we can now look at some of the sort of results we've seen for wider sets of organisations since we've rolled this out. So one of the things that many of you will be aware is that the STEM jobs in particular suffer from a real lack of diversity. And so we specifically looked at the subset of roles that have come through applied. This was about 2 years ago. That were STEM related roles. So you can see this is how I sort of parceled out the different types of roles that had come through for different organization types. So we've got strategy consultants that hire through us. We've got VC firms, we've got engineering firms, and people who hire into science and technology roles. So I looked at data covering about 40,000 candidates for hundreds of roles and about 50 of our clients. And I was specifically interested in this case on what the uplift for ethnic minority candidates or people of colour would be. And you can see here, I've compared the rate of hire of those particular candidates through applied compared to, for example, the UK population at large, or even compared to the sort of scientific or STEM workforce in the UK, or even the workforce if you exclude health sector. And you can see that people of colour are more likely to be hired through applied methods at a rate of about 2 to 3 times higher than you would otherwise expect comparing to benchmarks. What we've more recently done is also had a look at that data, looking at women in particular and non-binary candidates. And we've seen that on applied, if you look at the candidates hired through applied, about 41% of those candidates in STEM roles are women and non-binary candidates. And even if we look at some more senior roles across all roles, not just STEM, about 59% of all the candidates getting hired through applied are women and non-binary identifying. So we can see quite sizable uplifts actually when we kind of look at a cross-section of all of our hiring organisations based on particular diversity characteristics. But I think one of the things that I wanted to sort of show you in sort of closing here is actually the kind of way that we also try to measure ourselves. So obviously we collect stacks and stacks of data and we measure and test using experiments and others, all sorts of things to test whether what we're doing is actually having the impact that we want to see. But at the end of the day, it's also real people's experience of work that we care about. And so what I thought I'd share with you here is an example of Kayla, who was hired into a pension fund here in Australia at Future Super. And something that she wrote on LinkedIn once she was hired. She came into the organisation having come through applied and then analysed all of their data through applied and found that 53% of the people that they were hiring into their pension fund identified as women and 73% of them identified as a person of colour. But what I thought I'd also share with you was her own experience was that she'd applied to this particular organisation using her CV before they'd used applied a few years prior. And she'd been rejected for that particular job. But a few years later, she applied again, and it was through a new process that didn't involve looking at her CV, and she got through. So she's just one example, a sample size of one, so we should be careful. But at the end of the day, at Applied, one of the things that we really care about is helping people who are skilled for the role be seen for the talents that they have, and to try and level the playing field for everyone across the hiring organisation. Thank you very much.